All right. Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to another future-focused weekly update. I am your host, Christopher Lind, and if I am doing my job well, I am bringing some context and perspective to the latest happenings at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. Big thank you to all of you who watch, consume, listen, read, however you're consuming my content. I genuinely appreciate it. If you would do me a huge favor, if you are watching or listening and you are not following or subscribed to my stuff, please do so. And also, if you could give it a like, review, rating, all that stuff, and share it with somebody you think might also benefit from it. I put this together to really try and help people stay ahead. And the more that I can do that for, the better. Also, please send me things along. I really enjoy it. One of the things I'm covering this week actually came from a listener. And so thank you to you who sent that. I really appreciate when people bring things to my attention and go, hey, did you see this research, or are you involved in any of this other stuff? So let me give you a quick rundown of what I'm talking about, and then we'll get into it. So this week I've got 3 updates that I'm going to talk through. The first is this Axios article that's making its rounds, where the CEO of Anthropic had some things to say about where the future is going. The article itself is called "Behind the Curtain: A White-Collar Bloodbath" by Axios. And it's hyped, as you would expect, but there's some legitimate stuff that I want to talk through. The next one that I want to talk through was the one that was actually shared to me by a viewer. It has to do with some research that came out of the Alan Turing Institute and Lego. They partnered up to talk about the impacts of generative AI on children. And I think there's some really insightful things that we need to take into consideration that did come out of this. And then the third one, stick around for this one, because this one is blowing up the hype cycle everywhere and taking heat from all sides. But Apple came out with some big findings on how well AI is actually doing reasoning. And so their research on the illusion of thinking and what this means for artificial intelligence. And I'll talk about what I think we really need to be paying very close attention to based on what this research has to say. So those were the 3. Let's transition and get straight into it. So starting with let me flip over to it. Starting with this Axios article, like I said, this came from an interview that was done with Dario Amodei, I think is how you say his last name. He is the CEO of Anthropic, one of the major generative AI companies out there that's doing a ton of work. And he did this interview where he talked with some pretty staggering statistics. The one that you're seeing a ton of has to do with the impact of unemployment on new and younger entry-level white-collar jobs. I mean, this is the statistic you'll probably see everywhere. 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years are going to be unemployed, which for an audience of people that already, I mean, I remember back to my early 20s, that's one of the most difficult times in general, that you've got to deal with. Now, on top of it, you're competing against artificial intelligence, which is just misunderstood largely anyway. And one of the other quotes he brought up that I don't think is wrong is that in the next few years, we might, have identified, AI might have helped identify the cure for cancer. We might see economic growth on a macro level, work on balancing budgets, and yet 20% of people are going to have no jobs. Now, one of the things that this article is taking some real heat from that I think is very interesting is it is a little ironic that you see this pretty frequently. The heads of these major AI companies are, proclaiming these pretty apocalyptic things about what the tech is doing, where it's going, how bad it's going to be for everybody. And you almost kind of look at it and go, I mean, you're the one doing this. So what I would say, and this is something I would put to any leader out there who is really either involved in the creation of AI products or things like that, we need to be doing more to help prepare for it instead of just telling people this is going to be bad, everybody, pay attention. Because my observation has been, I don't think I've talked to many people, and actually the research I covered last week seems to validate this. There seems to be a general acceptance that this is serious. that people are recognizing this is a big deal. We need to do something about it. And yet when you actually ask people what, they aren't really sure. And when I talk to a lot of companies who are involved in either implementing AI or companies that are going AI first, when I actually dig into, so what role do you play in actually helping people get better at this? It's met with a lot of blank stares. And I think we can do such a better job of helping people know what to do. And you're going to hear me talk more about this because this is something I'm really making a big deal about. But this was largely why I created my AI effectiveness report. And this isn't just a sales pitch. It really was because I recognized in myself. So this is a little bit of backstory behind it. Here, I'm doing my best to educate people on what to do, what's going on, how to be thinking about some of this stuff, which I think, and the feedback I get is that's helpful on a macro level. But when it comes down to a micro level of, okay, Christopher, but what about my situation? Like, where do I need to focus? What kinds of things could I be doing to prepare? That was something I felt convicted. You know what? I could be doing more of this. And that actually was what led me to create the AI effectiveness assessment type of a thing, was to be able to help people go, you need personalized feedback on, do you need to know more technical knowledge? Do you need to know more, do you need to have more identity on how to use the tech? Do you need to, like, where is it that you need to be supported? And then once like, what are some initial steps? And that's really why I created this, because this was one of I actually just last night sent a message to Dario and I said, I love that you've got what I would consider, despite all the hype and the way news feeds frame it, I think he has a very balanced perspective on what's potentially ahead. But I'm like, what are you doing about it? And that's an area that I think many people are not there. So whether you use my AER or whether you're doing something, I would encourage people to go beyond, especially if you're in a leadership role, if you're overseeing people, if you're in a company making decisions, if you're going AI first, please make sure that a sizable percentage of your time is committed to helping people through that transition. This is not we're just going to implement the tech and see what happens. And if I can help in any way, please let me know. And if it's not me, I can help connect you with somebody who can, because this is what's getting missed right now. And this is what I think I am continuing to see freak people out, is they're seeing the world change around them and it feels very out of control and out of their hands. And it doesn't have to be that way. There are what I would consider simple steps. And yes, does it mean, investing in a percentage of your effort alongside the change management and the bringing people along? Yes. But the net return on that, you're going to get that paid back in dividends, because the retention, the scalability, the effectiveness of what you're doing is going to go up exponentially. And people aren't taking that into account. Now, related to that, I want to talk about one of the things that this brought up that I think we really need to talk about, because Dario's real emphasis, and that's everywhere. And I talk to lots of people who are Gen Zers. I know I've got a growing number of you who are listening and watching this. And then I've got the Gen Alphas, where I've got my 8 kids that I'm talking with, but then there's also just younger folks who are starting to recognize, what does this mean for me? Which is why I included the Lego research. But the statistic that he cited, and again, for him, it was just a projection, but 10 to 20% of entry-level white-collar jobs just being potentially wiped out. That's millions. And I think we need to be really, really, really cautious about this, because I understand where companies are. I understand where the perception comes from. I actually saw a thing last night put out by some people that are saying, like, this is the best news ever for seasoned professionals, because AI can do all the things the junior folks can do. And so now companies are going to need more seasoned folks than ever. And in some ways, I say, yeah, I agree. But I don't think the way we're approaching it is healthy. And it's very short-sighted, because as companies are cutting back, and you don't have to look very far to see the job cuts, and I'll talk more about that next week probably, but a lot of them are these entry-level, lower-level jobs that companies are going, yeah, we don't need these folks because AI can do it. So not only, if you've listened to me, do you know that I think that's a big risk just in general, because you're becoming over-dependent on this tech. But it's very short-sighted in the sense that your seasoned professionals, the folks who are sticking around, who've been around the block, they're not going to be there forever. And this is where our lack of being able to think past the end of our noses is really, really bad, because that intellectual capital, there's an assumption, and this is a false assumption that I think we need to be careful of. There's this false assumption that, oh, AI will just learn from these folks, and then when they leave, AI will pick up the pieces and stick around for the Apple research, because that's not the case. And you're going to need people to manage this stuff. And if you've just basically eradicated that growing set of talent who is going to fill in the term in HR as succession planning, if you're wiping out the whole pool of people who is there to fill in the gaps because you're going, AI is going to do that, you're banking on AI doing all that, and you're not going to be preparing the younger generation for this. So this is a real issue. On top of it, last week I talked about the fact that AI creates this cognitive dissonance, and I had a conversation with someone yesterday about this, that we're building our own echo chambers. And so while, yes, it's good to have AI there to help support you and take care of some of the stuff that's eating up your time, you need the other perspectives. You need those younger voices who go, that's stupid. Why would you do that? What a waste of time. Do you not know how this is changing? Do you not know that this is not the way things are going to? Can you explain to me why you do that? And without those voices, you're never actually challenged enough to think about it. And so this whole idea that we need to move away from, low white entry-level jobs and just let AI do entry-level jobs is not going to prepare us when we need those entry-level people to not be entry-level people anymore, and we haven't done anything. And I've seen this, having spent a career in onboarding, career development, human performance. Companies miss this all the time. So this isn't just a new problem, but AI is going to turn the volume up on it big time. And my biggest concern is we're not going to catch it, because we're going to go, well, we're doing fine right now. And then the people are going to leave, and you're going to go, well, who do we get? And you're going to go to hire people, and there's not going to be any qualified applicants. And even if you find qualified applicants, they aren't familiar with your internal workings. They aren't familiar with your internal systems or how things have been done. So you're now churning over. You see this when companies turn over senior leadership all the time. The company just stagnates because you lose all the consistent momentum that keeps moving. So then sometimes the questions I get is, well, what do we do with that? And this, I think, is going to be one of the other areas, and then I'll wrap this one up, that companies really need to focus on. We need to put a lot of work into developing leaders to know how to develop other people. We need to do that, because part of the reason companies are believing this idea that, oh, we just can get AI, we don't need entry-level talent, is because leaders actually believe that. They think I'm smart enough, I know what to do. If I only had just a little digital intern to do all my busy work, I could just hold on to this myself. And it's a very selfish mindset that is very short-sighted. And so, one, we need to develop younger talent. We got to we got to work together to bring things and help develop this future generation. But we've also got to change the existing leaders to change their mindset about this and understand that you can't just keep doing it all yourself. It's it's going to fall apart on you. Or when AI fails and you've got no backups and you haven't even been working with your teams anymore because you've been counting on AI to do everything for you. This is very much short-term thinking, and it's short-term thinking that we've got to work around. And if we don't, we're going to be in for some serious trouble. So what I agree with from, Dario, I think was his name, that he does repeat throughout is not enough people are taking this seriously. Not enough people are taking this seriously. Not enough people are taking this seriously. People aren't taking seriously what's coming. I agree with him. I think his position of it's just this way, I think is incomplete. And that's why I'm saying we need to be thinking more about, so what are we going to do about it? And it's bigger than just awareness. It's bigger than just convincing more people the future of AI is going to hit us like a ton of bricks. It's got to be, so here's what we're going to do about it. And here's how we're developing people. And here's how we're developing these senior leaders to break the mindset that they have all the answers. So we've got to do better. And, I think if you can step down from the hype of, oh, this is the end of the end of employment for white collar young talent. This is where things are going. This is going to change us, and everybody needs to start paying attention, and it's going to be great. And actually go, well, how do we know that? How do we prepare for that? And how do we make sure it's a success? I think that's where we can take the truth of what Dario is saying and actually action it. All right. So with that, let's transition to topic number 2, which is some research by the Alan Turing Institute in partnership with Lego. If you want to check this out, the research itself is called Understanding the Impacts of Generative AI's Use on Children. And it gets into, really like what are the effects of this for kids, which I think is really important, especially given what I talked about a minute ago, about how important it is to think about not just, well, how do we keep the current folks out there moving, but how do we actually prepare for the future? And so this really started to study, how are kids interacting with generative AI? How do they feel about it? Where is their benefits? Where are their risks? What is the general consensus of the adults who are involved in this? And so some statistics that came out of the research that I thought were kind of interesting, that, some of the key findings that they brought up with this was kids 8 to 12, all right, are already using these tools, and pretty frequently at that. I mean, once a month or more, 72% once a month or more. So it's a pretty frequent usage of this, and 22% as a whole. So in the age range of 8 to 12, kids 8 to 12, that's young. I mean, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 kids in that age range. And so I have a pretty keen sense of like where they are and my kids do not currently use, just so that'll be a question I get, do your kids use these things? No. Do I educate and teach and coach them on it? Yes, but they don't have access to these tools for reasons that I'm happy to talk about off camera. But 22% do. So we've already got a quarter of children in the age range of 8 to 12 who are already using this. Interestingly, there was actually more females are using it than males, which was really interesting in terms of how people are using it. Now, a lot of this is in the tools themselves. ChatGPT was the most popular, hands down, with the kids who are using it. A lot of ChatGPT users, then Gemini's coming in after that. And then a lot of it is, after that, you've got kids who are doing within their apps and things like that. Now, what was interesting is the way kids are using this is largely for fun, creative things. So when you actually dug into the research, I feel like in some ways, kids are better at understanding how to use this than adults. That, honestly, you want my biggest take from the research from Lego is I think kids have a better understanding of the tech and the best way to use it than adults do. And you might go, well, wait a minute, Christopher, you just said kids are using it for fun, creativity, and learning. I thought we should be using this for robotic, all this other stuff. Yes, that's where it should be taking that off of our plate. But the part that I think is actually going to bring out the best version of us is when we're engaging with it to help us, expand our creativity, when we're using it to expand some of the fun and experimentation things that we could do. Now, I also think this is very concerning that it didn't necessarily get into it in super detail, but I don't know how much parent involvement or educator involvement is involved with some of this stuff. I did scan through some of this. They're looking at it really largely through a academic standpoint. So, obviously there's more kids in private school, which I think elevated yet another risk that we saw in this, is that equity to access is not necessarily balanced. Kids that are in a maybe less equitable environment have less access to it. So again, might this help fuel the divides of the haves and the have-nots? I think that was another really interesting thing that came to be with this. Now, I don't know necessarily so what do we do with that, other than we'll get to some of the things that we can be doing with it. But it's definitely much more heavily used, 52% in private schools versus 18% in state schools. So again, we see a divide of, and that's not public schools don't get it. I just know how the prioritization of public schools and where they can spend their time and the funding that they have to do stuff, they just don't have it. So it's not so much a pointing finger. It's just a reality of kids in private schools have way more access. They're using it more. We're seeing this for creativity, for learning, for experimentation, stuff like that. And a sizable population. I mean, a quarter of kids. Think if 25% are using it before they're 12 on a regular basis, you can only imagine how that's going to expand. Now, I think where that's really concerning is the fact that these tools are largely being used by children, but they were not designed with them in mind. And that's why I say, when people are like, so Christopher, do your kids have access to ChatGPT? No, they do not. Why? Well, because these tools were not designed with them in mind. It was not designed with the safeguards of them in mind. It was not designed just from a user experience with them in mind. It was not at all. And so to me, that is one big concern I have about the data itself, is that we've got a heavy population of users who are not the intended user. And then you stack in there the equity of access to it. We potentially are dividing further. And then who's actually overseeing this? Now, the question then that begs is, what does that mean for the adults who are involved? How are they feeling about it? Which was another big area of the report. 76% of parents, this was a really interesting statistic. 76% of parents, they felt really positive about kids using AI. I think that's very interesting, and I'd actually love to get deeper into the analytics of which parents, because when I talk to parents, to me, I don't know that I see that positive, but maybe it's the second half that balances it. 76 felt good about AI use with kids. 82 are extremely worried about what their kids are going to encounter, whether it's inappropriate content, whether it's misinformation. So there's this almost paradox where parents are excited about AI, and yet they're very worried about what's going to happen with it. Teachers, educators, mass majority, 2/3 almost, or 3/4 almost, are very worried about what it's going to do to the critical thinking of kids. And, students regularly admit they submit stuff, and these are kids. So we see higher education worried about students submitting just complete AI slop. They're already doing it as kids. So if you're not taking that seriously already, if you're a higher education person, well, you better, because the kids are already getting used to it. Now, to this, couple reactions to this. I also thought it was interesting, I also think it's funny that teachers are so concerned about kids using it and submitting things, and yet 88% of them acknowledge they're using it. So it's like, so you don't want kids because you think it's somehow going to, ruin them, but you're using it. Like, this again goes back to this disconnect of, it's great for me. I think it's beneficial. I just don't want anybody else using it. And this is something that I will call attention to over and over and over, that this report just continued to reveal. We got to be so careful. There is this really, really, really bad tendency to say, the way everybody's using AI is wrong. It's terrible. They're not using it right. We got to put a stop to this. The way I use it, though, on the other hand, that is good. That is so not only are we losing our objectivity of, are we actually critically analyzing the way we're using it? And are we applying some of these same risks to ourselves? I've talked a lot about its erosion on critical thinking. Are we as adults looking at ourselves going, hey, wait a minute, am I using this in a way that's eroding my critical thinking or not? Instead of just going, it's going to ruin the kids' critical thinking. Well, that's definitely true if the people guiding and shepherding kids are the ones who are having their critical thinking eroded by AI. It's like yelling at the kids, don't do that as you're sitting, don't do as I do as I say. Come on, we got to watch this. And then this disconnect between, I'm really worried about it, or I'm excited about it, but I'm worried about how it's going to be used. Well, this concerns me as well, in that this goes back to what I brought up in my first point. There is a growing recognition of the risks of AI. There's a growing recognition that we've got to do something. There's a growing recognition of, where it's problematic. And yet there's a lack of, so what are you doing about it? How are you actually leaning in? If you're a teacher or a parent and you're not actively educating, modeling, engaging with your kids around AI, well, that's a problem, and that's a you problem. That's not something that you go, well, we got to get the teachers to fix this. We got to get the schools to fix this. We got to get the AI companies, right? Because the parents will point the finger at the teachers. The teachers will point the fingers at the AI companies. The AI companies will point them back at the users. And there's a lot of the game of hot potato, instead of going, all right, what is my sphere of influence? What can I do to help influence this in a positive way? And how can I lean in what's within my control? And I think what this report revealed is, we're still in hot potato mode. We're not in action mode, which is really problematic given the fact 25% of young children are already using this. So, we need to be doing more to the so what. So what do we do about this, and how do we prepare this? Now, I think one of the things that was really interesting, though, was coming into the fact I mentioned before, kids are using it for creativity. They're using it for creating images and doing this. Now, you're going to get the folks who go, I hate that. They need to learn to draw with crayons and all these other things. Maybe, and I don't think it's necessarily bad, because you see this in the results from teachers. Some teachers hate this. They think, some say it really helps bring out creativity. Others say it really harms it, because if you talk to anybody who comes from a minority group, they'll say AI does not really represent us well. And when you think about the fact that a lot of the data it's trained on is not necessarily super diverse data, so it's not surprising it doesn't represent things. So I think both can be true. Can AI help with creativity? Yes. Is it inherently going to? No, because it's not trained on and is not representative of everybody, which goes back to my other point. If we are just letting kids 8 to 12 have a ChatGPT subscription and going, go do your thing, that is a major problem. Versus if we sit and lean in with kids and go, hey, let's talk about this. Now, to some of the questions I get, well, you said you don't give your kids access to it. That is true. However, there are lots of times I will sit with my kids and I will literally work with them on, hey, let me show you how I use it. Let's do a brainstorming session. I had them help me brainstorm some creative ideas using generative AI. And we talked through, hey, how are you using it? Daddy, let me explain to you. Daddy's going to explain to you, how do we write the prompt? And I actually asked them, how could we improve the prompt? What is not accurate about what's coming out of this? Where did it get it wrong? This whole coaching and mentoring, which ties back to my first point of this whole, like, let's just freak out about it or pretend it's not here and then hope the future generation figures it out, is not healthy. It's not healthy at all. Now, something else, so we got to be guiding this. And I think that's one thing that the report does an okay job of, but this was really more like, what do we know about it? It did have some recommendations at the end, which I'll talk through. But this one was kind of largely, hey, here's what we found. Here's what we need to potentially do. The other thing that I thought was really beneficial that I actually want to call attention to is kids with learning disorders actually benefited the most from this. And I think this is one where you actually saw a staggering difference. Kids with learning disabilities, kids who struggled, the percentage, it was like 53% versus 20%, I think, of like how frequently are they using this. I can just validate this over and over and over in my own anecdotal experience and some of the research that I've seen, that AI can unlock capabilities that people frequently had struggled with in the past. There's a number of people I know who I've coached and worked with who they struggled with putting their thoughts into paper. They struggled with taking something that they had in their head and actually representing it visually. They struggled, and AI was able to do that for them. It was almost like it unlocked something they had. That, I think, is something we really need to lean into, because before it was just, okay, well, they're cognitively impaired or they have a mental disability or cognitive disability, so we'll give them an AEP or whatever. And it was kind of a unsustainable, unscalable model. And I think AI can really help with some of this stuff. And it can help, I think, level the playing field for some of the kids who historically have struggled. But that's not going to happen if we have educators who go, I don't want kids using AI, or if we just blindly let kids use it without any sort of guidance and recommendations from things. And so I think that's a huge, huge area that we could be looking at going, hey, where are the have-nots? Where are the ones who really have historically struggled? And how do we use this tool to help increase their capability? I think that's a big area we can lean into. Now, I think it's also important that we take into consideration what we saw from this research of what kids actually wanted. And this goes back to some of my points of, I think kids actually have a better pulse on how to use AI than adults often do. They care about the future of the world, and they don't like how AI, its energy impact. Kids care about that. They care about how are we getting the resources to fuel and fund this. They care about its equitable use. Kids are more skeptical of the outputs they get. And I see that with kids. Why? Kids are, in some ways, if you're a parent, you know how sometimes you want to pull out, well, I can't pull out my hair, but kids ask why. Are you sure? Explain that to me. Adults are much more vulnerable to go, yeah, good enough. Sounds right. Kids don't. And I think that's a really good thing that we should learn from kids. I think there's a lot we can learn from kids as we look at it. They don't want it to replace friendships. They don't want it to replace human connections. They are very much hey, let's keep the human community element human. I don't want an AI friend. Now, I know from other research that unchecked, they're very vulnerable to having that very easily changed, as they start struggling with feeling connected and feeling like they don't know how to connect with other people. AI can quickly fill that void, which is why I think just handing a kid an AI subscription and going, I'm sure they'll be fine, is very, very dangerous. I think this whole helping the ones who have struggled historically with the traditional environment of academia, which is why this whole, hey, kids are just using it to cheat. Cheat what, though? A lot of the ways we've assessed people's intelligence and capability is terrible. It's terrible. So to just say, we're not going to let kids use it, or we are, and just get better at detecting when AI is cheating, how about we reassess the way we're evaluating effectiveness and people's capabilities. I mean, there's some real opportunity here, and AI is demonstrating it's helping either us come up with new ways of assessing, or we might need to lean in and go, well, okay, maybe somebody struggles at writing a paper because they're dyslexic, or they struggle with just being able to organize their thoughts because of ADHD or autism. Well, why wouldn't we allow AI to help them do that if it can overcome some of their challenges, if we need to get them to fit into the more traditional model or blow up the traditional model? I think there's two paths we can take, and AI can play a role in all of it. But another one they consistently saw, kids do not see themselves represented. They are far more attuned and in sync with reality than I think sometimes adults are. And that came through. And I think, as we look forward to this, some of the recommendations, they outlined 7, and I think they were really good, is, one, we need to build child-friendly AI. And whether that's new frontier models or whether we're finding ways to govern it, I'm hesitant with that, in that there's sometimes this so somebody else build a safe AI. I think where that can really work ties into one of the other recommendations is we should be including kids in this. We should be including kids in the design, including kids' input on what worked, what didn't work. Where are you seeing flaws? I think sometimes we assume the most seasoned people always have the best ideas. Historically, my experience has been actually that's not always the case. You need a balance. So I think continuing to boost literacy, inclusion of kids in design and feedback, whether we have traditional models, just kid-friendly versions, or actual kid-friendly AI models, I don't know. But I think we need to close the gap. Some of the recommendations were around fair access. How do we close those gaps? How do we increase representation through the data that is used to train these models? Things like that. How are we finding balance? I think kids more than anyone want balance. I think adults do too. Having been an educator in early years, adults want balance too. But I think another one, and this is just where I'll close, this is not a somebody else has to take care of this for us. It's not, like I said many times, tech companies will blame the people. Leaders will blame the people underneath them. People underneath them will blame the leaders. Everybody will point. And there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of hot potato. We got to get away from that. We just got to do. We just got to work. We got to coach the younger generation. We can't hand them a subscription. We have to sit down with them. Parents need to do that. Teachers need to do that. We need to reinvent things with kids included in that design. This is very much a collaboration that needs to happen. And I think I love Lego. I'm a big fan of the work they do. I'm not as familiar with Alan Turing, but I think one of the things that I trust them very much in, and the research is there, and I think there's a path forward. So all that to say, definitely check it out. I'd encourage you to go look it up, Understanding the Impacts of Generative AI Use on Children, if you want to see more of the specifics and details. But I think some of the biggest things are, this is an inevitability, and so we need to be preparing for what do we do with it. Okay, final home stretch. Let's talk about this Apple research, because Apple was all over the place because of how it was blowing up. Let's see. What were some of the headlines? It's pouring water on the AI industry and all this other stuff, because let me just explain here's the one sentence summary. AI only gives the illusion of thinking, and it blows up. It collapses in on itself. That's really the genesis of what this report came to find. And it's taking heat from all over. So I'll explain what it's taking heat for, what I think is fair, what things we really need to talk about. And what it really focused on was LRMs, which, if you're not as familiar with LRMs versus LLMs, it's not necessarily a radically different technology so much as the way the technology works. So one is a large language model, one is a large reasoning model. We need to break these down because a lot of the frontier models are large reasoning models, or you can flip on large reasoning capability alongside them. versus, kind of the basic ones. So what's the difference? I think it is important to understand this because these 3-letter acronyms get thrown around, or we assume everybody knows what they are. Now, just to give an example of what's a large reasoning model, or what are some examples, OpenAI's O1 and O3, DeepSeek R1 would be LRMs, Claude 3.7, Sonnet Thinking, Gemini Thinking. So think of some of those, the deep research, the thinking models versus, just OpenAI 4.0, I think would probably be considered more of an LLM, although it has some of its reasoning capabilities built into it. But really what it is LLMs are literally just trying to look at basic pattern recognition. You asked for this, it ingests it, and then it tries to predict what you want. So 2 + 2 = 4, because it's consistently seen in the data. Whenever it sees 2 + 2 together, it just knows 4. So it's purely text prediction. What they wanted to look at was LRMs, which is where it goes a step further and it does this multi-step reasoning. So this is where you see COT, or chain of thought, where it'll do its step-by-step instructions. So it almost does more, and this is where I'm really hesitant to frame it this way because it gets misinterpreted. Self-reflection. So it's reasoning on its reasoning. It's thinking on what it thought about before it actually answers. So, let me add step 2 and 2. The result is 4. So it can explain what it's doing, which is a step towards explainable AI, but it's also, on the surface, looks like more advanced reasoning. So the LLMs are great for fast, efficient, straightforward. I just need you to do this. Very shallow reasoning. It's not going to do a lot of problem solving. So if you need it to help generate a description for a YouTube video, an LLM is fine. You don't need it to do some deep reasoning on how did you come to that conclusion. If you're putting in a financial report and asking it to come up with what are 10 of the most, ideal patterns in this, you're not going to want an LLM because it's just going to look for pure pattern recognition and spit it out. It might give you some stuff to go off of. An LRM supposedly will then do more of its analysis on, well, here's what I'm seeing. Then let me actually draw conclusions. I'm actually checking on this. It's thinking, supposedly. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the difference between an LRM, LLM, which is why you see different models used for different things like advanced coding, advanced problem solving versus people generating AI slop on the internet. Those are your LLMs. What they discovered, though, which I think was really kind of fascinating with this, was these LRMs are getting much better at looking like they're doing reasoning. And I've talked about this in a number of updates. They look like they're, mulling through all this different stuff. And when you ask it to explain its chain of thought, it gives very detailed answers for how it does it, which is extremely deceptive in that it looks like, wow. It's like when somebody rambles, and if they ramble long enough, you're just convinced that they gave you they thought about this deeply. So that must mean their answer is more comprehensive, more complete. And that's what largely these LRM companies, or, the AI companies, have been pushing, is that it is. Because look how detailed its thinking is. Look at how it's analyzing all this stuff, and look at all the details it's sharing. What Apple did was they said, okay, but let's actually look at, is it producing better results? And this is something I talk about all the time. Just because something looks really good does not mean it's better. It might be more convincing. It might sound much more robust and therefore make you think, wow, this is actually powerful. But Apple said, well, let's test it. And what they did was they looked at the 3 different levels of complexity. So low complexity, hey, there's not a lot of complexity. The LLMs, just the pattern recognition, you don't need it to think, you just need it to do. LLMs perform better. Actually putting LRMs on it actually was worse. So this is one of the ones where I sometimes see this, where people go, oh, I like to use the more advanced models on my more mundane tasks because it gives a better output. And I'm like, actually, according to Apple's research, no, it doesn't. And that's been my own personal experience, is whenever I ask a more advanced LRM model to give me a response or an answer to something that's low, I'm like, actually, no, it's worse. And the data proves it. Apple was like, yeah, no, if you're putting an LLM or an LRM on stuff. Now, this should help inform business leaders, decision makers, because there's going to be pressure to use the more advanced, more expensive models on certain things, which goes back to something I say all the time. We need to be digging into what are we really asking it to do? What is the complexity of what we need it on? And of course, an AI company is going to want you to pay for the more expensive tokens for basic tasks. Well, the data shows you don't want to use the more expensive tokens on basic tasks. The basic model, the LLM, will produce better results. So if you're a decision maker, all the more reason to be looking at what are we actually asking it to do and what is the right model to be using for certain things, because we could be overpaying millions, hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars spent on a Ferrari to go get groceries. And in practice, that model holds up, that example holds up, because a Ferrari is a terrible thing to go get a big grocery order for. You're going to need to take 10 trips. It's inefficient. You're going to end up spending more on just maintenance on all this just to get groceries. Like, what are you doing? And the same is true with AI. If you're using these advanced reasoning models on basic automation tasks, you are not only spending way more money than you need to, but you're getting a worse result. So I think that's one thing that, and I dug through all the details of it. There's strong evidence that that is the case. So if you're a decision maker, you need to know that. If you're an individual, you need to know that, because there can be the temptation, oh, the more advanced one, better results. Actually, no. If you're asking one of the more advanced models to give you basic responses to simple tasks, and not simple, don't think simple just like super simple, like what we might consider advanced reasoning, like, hey, what would be a really compelling YouTube description for this? Or how might I kick off something like that? That is a simple task. That is a simple task. That is not an advanced reasoning task. So it's important to understand what simple task versus advanced task is. So low complexity, LLMs crushed it. Medium complexity, that's where the LRMs start to outperform things. So that's where we start to see, okay, these LRMs begin to do a better job, because when you start getting into that blurry territory between basic, reasoning, I just need you to do something versus I need you to think about this a little bit, the LRMs start to outperform. Okay. It's still not perfect, which is why you need to do a critical analysis of how advanced is this really? And is this a medium complexity, or is this really low complexity type of thing? Because again, you might be overpaying. You might be getting worse results on this. But if it is medium complexity, this is where the LRMs perform better. So if you're doing more advanced tasks, this is where they perform. But what was fascinating, and this is the part that just blew apart the industry that Apple's taking tons of heat for, is on high complexity, zero accuracy. I mean, it just fell off the planet. So if you're asking it to do advanced, highly complex things, at some point, it reaches a level of complexity that it falls through the floor. It just literally bottoms out, and its accuracy is absolute garbage in terms of what it's producing. And so I think this is really important to consider with this, because going back to overdependency and going, okay, we're going to hand it this really, really complicated stuff, and these advanced reasoning models that we're being told are smarter than everybody is going to fix this for us. The data doesn't support it. Now, as you can imagine, there's lots of people throwing shade on Apple's research going, yeah, you're only saying that because you're behind in the AI race and you're trying to throw water on all your competitors. I dug into the research, and I feel it's very strong and very compelling in terms of how they went about it. And it also matches what Apple has a history of doing, which is they're not first to the party. they don't throw all their eggs in the hype basket and think we'll just figure it out on the other end. They usually are slower and more thoughtful in what they do, and they wait to see what's really going on here, and then we're going to come into play. And I think that's what they're doing here. So to the people who are Apple haters or going, yeah, this is just people trying to slow down progress, I'd encourage you to actually go read the actual report and see what it says, because you'll see the data in there. And I think it's really important that, yeah, when it gets up into this advanced thinking, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Now you might go, well, why? Why not? What's happening? Here's the best way I can explain it. I think actually it's because it's not actually reasoning. And this isn't just unique to AI. So I don't want to just say this is just an AI problem. But here's where things fall apart: overthinking is a major problem. It's a major problem for this. You see in the data, like in the beginning, it actually almost gets the right answer at first in advanced reasoning. And then it gets caught in its reasoning cycle. And as it does, it just exponentially gets worse. Now, I think we can all relate to that. Have you ever overthought a problem where had you gone with your initial gut instinct, you would have been right? And the data shows you that I remember this from academics. People were like, if you're taking a test, usually go with your initial instinct. Almost the vast majority of time, it's correct compared to when you sit and go, no, that can't possibly be it. Let me rethink that. I have to. AI models do the same thing. They run into the same problem. They start overthinking themselves. They actually talk themselves out of the right answer. And it happens consistently. The further it goes down the line, the further it falls off. And so when you're asking it to reason these very advanced, complex things, it's why it falls through the floor, because you're actually asking it to go super deep. And the deeper it goes, the further it falls off. And I think, one of the things they said, and I think it's a fair point, is it's not actually reasoning. It's not actually thinking critically, even though it looks like it. It's designed to mimic us. And so it looks like it is. It comes up with a conclusion and it looks like, oh, I'm reanalyzing and all this other stuff, but it doesn't generalize things very well. So it can't actually come up with a general consensus and then test its general consensus and pressure test it, all this other stuff. So it doesn't reason the way a team of human beings coming together, pressure testing each other on some of this stuff. But like I said, even humans are vulnerable in this. We do the same thing. We'll have a great idea and we'll literally murder the great idea because we spent way too much time thinking about it. It's not good. It's not good. The more advanced, it just consistently showed, the more advanced you go, the worse it gets. Now, I think this is problematic because you would say, well, this conflicts with what we're seeing in all the current benchmarking data. Well, that's because a lot of these benchmarks that are saying, oh, it's just getting so much better, they're benchmarking the wrong things. And they're looking at measures that aren't necessarily telling us, is it getting us a better result? Is it actually getting us to a better outcome? No, it's not. And that's extremely concerning. And I think it goes back to, we might have to rethink how, because going back to what I said about the difference between an LLM and an LRM, they're different, but they're still based on language alone. So it's still just looking at word patterns, word structures, things like that, and then reflecting and meditating on the same thing, but it's just kind of spinning and then spitting out a different answer. I think you almost have to look at the architecture if we're going to break through this. If we just keep saying, well, just have it spend more time looking at the language over and over and over, you got to think about it. And this is something I talk about with AI all the time. With AI, if it trips up early on, the further it goes, it's just going to amplify what it does, which is what you see happening with these LRMs, is it gets the right answer, kind of, but there might, or mostly, but any of those flaws, then as it continues its line of reasoning, just get amplified. And so by the time you get to the end, it's just way off. It's just way off. It's not even accurate anymore. And I think that's where the way we're doing it, we keep trying to refine and perfect the LLM architecture. And I think what this is showing is, hey, we got to like re-architect this stuff, which makes me wonder if Apple is actually working on new ways of reasoning, ways of doing something different. And again, this is talking about hitting the ceiling that all AI models have hit with their neural networks. They kind of hit a ceiling, a wall. And then after that, it's kind of like, okay, well, it can't really go beyond this. This is very problematic given how many companies are counting on AI and these advanced models to do more of their work. I see this with tech companies who are wiping out their developers going, well, we've got these advanced AI models that are crushing benchmarks. They're more effective than our humans. And it's like, actually not. And now you're banking on them, and you may not even realize how wrong it is until it's too late. So, yeah, all that to say, this is another reason why we need to slow down. You need to really critically analyze, what are you actually using AI on? Are you using the right model? Are there things we should just go, AI is not actually going to be good for this? Because if we ask it to, whatever it gives us is actually going to be wrong. And so where do we draw the line and go, this is as far as AI is going to take us? And then we need humans to close the loop. We need humans to take over in the advanced reasoning because AI just can't. Is it ever going to get there? I don't even want to speculate on it because the models are changing so fast, but I see why the AI companies are not happy with AI's research, and why it does kind of blow the lid off. Hey, those benchmarks that you're using to market how your AI can do the work of the most seasoned, advanced professionals, and you can just get rid of people. Actually, no, you can't. And you're not going to notice it because it looks very convincing. Its thinking is very convincing. And that's why I think the article, The Illusion of Thinking, is spot on, because it is creating the illusion. You've got these critical, thoughtful, well-reasoning AI models, and actually they're not. So be careful. And more to come on that. I'm interested to see where some of this stuff plays out. And if there will be some new architecture, I'll keep you up to date on that. But like always, I hope this was helpful. I hope you now have greater context into what some of these things were, what some of the impact was for all of you. And with that, we will see you on the other side.